Why don't we jump in? I think some people will be just getting their coffee and tea ready to go here in Canada, and maybe whiskey and a beer in Australia, just given the time difference. I am thrilled to be joined today by Luke Menzel, who runs the Energy Efficiency Council, our counterpart in Australia. Welcome, Luke. How are you?
Hey, Corey, pleasure to be here.
Yeah, good to see you. And for those that kind of follow our social media and kind of follow a lot of the different presentations and things that we do, Luke was gracious enough to host us for a podcast slash webinar live presentation a few weeks ago. I had to do it sort of in the evening. And so I forced Luke to do the same thing on his end. And just before this call, we realized that not only is it 11 p.m. his time, but he's got another webinar, actually, funny enough, with a colleague from Carleton University at 7:30 a.m. his time. So he'll be kind of going webinar to sleep to webinar and talking to Canadians all the way through. So thanks for doing all that, Luke.
No, not at all. And I suppose it's the brave new world we all find ourselves in, isn't it? So, there's a lot of bad things to say about COVID. But one of the good things is that it's allowed us to make all these connections with fellow organisations around the world. And I'm certainly finding myself spending a lot more time talking to equivalent organisations, whether it's in North America or Europe or Asia, because we're all fundamentally grappling with the same things when it comes to energy efficiency.
That's right. Yeah. So for those watching for this webinar, to be a little bit different, normally what we do is our guest does a formal presentation and then we have Q&A. This one's just going to be a conversation. We're hoping, that we get into some of the details of what the Energy Efficiency Council has been up to and maybe tackle some of the similarities and differences between Australian energy efficiency policy and Canadian policy. And then we'll open it up for Q&A, and I've got a few questions teed up, but if others will have, then feel free to post it in the chat or into the Q&A buttons at the bottom of your Zoom. So why don't we get in? Maybe we can start. Luke, tell me or tell the audience about the EEC and a little bit of the background and history, so we have just a general context of what the organization is all about.
Yeah, sure. So the Energy Efficiency Council is the peak body for energy efficiency, energy management and demand response in Australia. So we have around 100 members, everything from small consultancies that are providing bespoke energy efficiency advice right through to multinationals like Siemens and Schneider Electric and the like. We also have local governments, we have universities, we have a number of other industry and professional associations that represent like manufacturers and the property sector, different parts of the economy. And so it's a pretty diverse group, but it's united in a common cause of elevating the role of energy efficiency, energy management, demand response in the energy transition that we're all working our way through. The genesis of the organisation really was back in the late 2000s, sort of 2008, 2009, we had a new progressive Labor government here in Australia. There was a lot of talk about climate change. It was sort of post-inconvenient truth. We had a drought here in Australia in the mid-2000s. There was a lot of concern and a lot of momentum towards climate action. It was an observation from the energy efficiency sector that we were talking a lot about renewables and the role of renewables in the transition. And obviously that's, as we all know, very important, but not a lot of talk about the role of the demand side in driving down carbon emissions. And so there's a view that we needed a voice as a sector. And they recruited the founding CEO, Rob Murray-Leach, who was still head of policy here at the Energy Efficiency Council, to found the organisation and really fly the flag for the role that energy efficiency can play and all of that, as well as all the other great things we know it can do in terms of health and comfort and saving money and the multiple benefits of energy efficiency that you there at Efficiency Canada are so familiar with.
Yeah, and it strikes me, it's so interesting because you mentioned kind of like during one of these kind of side effects or impacts in positive ways during COVID is this kind of exchange, because we probably would have been too busy to connect with each other beforehand, but we, seeing some of your stuff and you seeing some of our stuff, we kind of connected with each other. And it is interesting, our history is very similar. this kind of need for a voice, this need to kind of exploit this pathway to decarbonizing. I'm curious on your end, because certainly one of my fun topics to talk about is the relationship we have with government. Because certainly in Canada, there's been some headway, and we have to always balance that applauding and making sure we celebrate when good policies happen. But we're also a critic and we're an advocate, and I'm curious kind of how that works on your end with your members, and maybe just give us a sense right now of like where things are, maybe federally or nationally in Australia with the government and your relationship with them.
Yeah, well, look, we, like you, aren't afraid to criticise. There is things about Australia's performance on energy efficiency to be disappointed by. The global benchmark for energy efficiency policy performance is really the ACCC's Global Energy Efficiency Scorecard that they release every 2 or 3 years. The most recent one, I think, was in 2019. And unhappily, Australia was 18 out of the 25 largest energy users in the world, and the worst in the developed world on energy efficiency policy and performance. Now, that's not to say there aren't bright spots. We're actually doing pretty well on commercial buildings. We've got a pretty sophisticated set of policies and programs and ratings for commercial buildings, and we're in some ways leading the world with our National Australian Built Environment Rating System. And the other part of the story that things like the ACCC's scorecard don't tell is kind of the differentiation in performance in terms of policy at the state level. And so we have states here in Australia that are just doing fabulous work, and really have been over the last decade, as well as states that aren't doing so well. I'm sure that's a theme that is pretty familiar there in Canada. So you're right. It's always a balancing act, because you want to have a constructive relationship with government. If you're constantly just bagging them, as we'd say here in Australia, you're not going to get very far.
I have never been accused of bagging someone, but I hope one day I am.
if you're constantly bagging, then they're just going to stop listening.
Right.
So you've got to celebrate the successes where they occur. But by the same token, if you're not calling out missed opportunities, then you're not doing your job. So that's a line that we work. But I'd say that the Energy Efficiency Council, we sort of tend to try and work constructively, and call things as we see them, but try and move the conversation forward in a proactive way.
Yeah, one of the things we've been successful at, I think, is matching out of COVID, matching kind of this. At least in Canada, this desire from the federal government and definitely some of the provincial governments, the desire to quote unquote build back better is what they call it. So trying to match, this economic recovery and kind of bring the economy back from COVID, but matching that directly with climate ambition. And our government has, like many other governments and many corporations, kind of committed to net zero. I'm not entirely sure they know exactly what that means and how hard it's going to be.
Possibly a good thing, Corey.
Yeah, maybe. Just like commit it. Yeah, come on, can't be that hard. But I'm curious on your end, has there been that kind of level of discussion with the Australian government on kind of matching economic recovery? I mean, I know Australia's kind of already kind of really, gone back to quote unquote normal, and the economy's kind of humming again, but any kind of discussion with that, and then the role energy efficiency can play in helping make that happen?
Yeah, sure. So I'm sure, like you there in Canada, we're really impressed with the work of the International Energy Agency in the middle of last year, with the work they did with the International Monetary Fund, really highlighting the role of, I guess, clean energy broadly and energy efficiency in particular as a stimulus measure, and the multiple dividends that investments in energy efficiency, especially in like building upgrades, could deliver. And so we were really championing that work. And, the response was mixed. It wasn't really picked up so much at the national level, but we had a couple of states who took it to heart, notably Victoria, where I am now. It's the second most populous state here in Australia, capital Melbourne. They announced a $1 billion energy efficiency stimulus package in their emergency budget back in October. And this is the most significant single spending measure from any state government on energy efficiency in Australia's history. And It kind of is it's the kind of the greatest hits of energy efficiency stimulus. You've got kind of residential building upgrades, you've got social housing, you've got working with manufacturers to improve their energy performance, you've got government building upgrades. They really sort of looked at the evidence from around the world in Victoria and took that to heart. Now there are a few kind of extenuating circumstances there. We've had a pretty easy run of it here in Australia on COVID, with the exception of Victoria. We did have a 4-month lockdown last year. So the Victorian economy was hurting in a way that other parts of the country just weren't. And so the level of interest and investment and stimulus just generally, and even putting aside energy efficiency, was that much greater in Victoria. And it's really interesting. And we're very conscious of how lucky we are here in Australia at the Energy Efficiency Council. And when we talk to friends around the world, many of them are just coming out of a very, very hard year. In broad terms, Australia's been very lucky. And that's flowed through the stimulus conversation. So there was a lot of talk of stimulus last year. This year, not so much. We've just we traditionally had our budgets in May, and it hasn't really been a conversation about stimulus. It's the government's felt like they spent the money last year. It's just like, we need to start to get our spending under control. So we sort of started to move out of that
Right.
phase. So yeah, it's interesting because the good thing that's happening though out of the Victorian spending is that it's driving program development and delivery in a whole bunch of areas that will be really crucial over the coming decade. And so it's driving policy and innovation, it's driving thinking about skills, it's driving thinking about supply chains. And so that's going to be, not just establish sort of, some of those things here in Victoria, but there's going to be lessons learned out of that stimulus program in Victoria that can be, spread right across the country.
Yeah, and I hope actually that happens everywhere, is that kind of foundational side, and that you mentioned kind of the skills and the worker side. Do you guys have issues in different trades and different energy efficiency sectors where you just can't find enough? And are you advocating for as much skills development as you are for like the policies?
Well, absolutely. And we've had conversations about this, Corey, about that sort of the relationship and the importance of making sure that when you do your job and you secure the spending in what is a really critical area, you make the point that you need to invest in the skills development and the jobs and the professional pathways to make sure that money is spent effectively and has the impact that you want it to have. The two things go hand in hand. There are huge opportunities in energy efficiency jobs. They're good local jobs. We know that. They're often, in times of economic disruption, they're often jobs which are attractive to people that are looking to transition out of other sectors. But you've got to create the pathways. And and in many cases where there hasn't previously been a strong driver for the services or the products or the installation and whatever it is, there's not necessarily the training programs or the certifications to easily just step in and ramp up. What I've learned, as we've been interacting around some of the roles that have been defined in Canada, particularly around residential energy efficiency, I think are a little way ahead of us here in Australia, and the government programs that Victoria is investing in is prompting some new thinking, some renewed thinking around, what roles do we need to create, what is the ecosystem of skills that need to sit around, say, a residential energy upgrade, a deep retrofit, because yes, we need this, we're spending all this money on stimulus over the next period of time, but we know we're going to have to transform our built environment over the next 10, 15, 20 years if we're ever going to have a chance of hitting that net zero target. So, it's a productive conversation, but it's not always the sexiest thing. energy efficiency is it can be a hard sell. Energy efficiency skills development, it's kind of it can often be the vestigial tail of policy that just gets slopped off at the last minute, so you really got to hammer it home.
Yeah, keep it sexy. That should be the motto. And on that point, for us, we're actually kind of excited when we get to have conversations with non-traditional departments, in government. Like, it's always been on our end. Natural Resources Canada has always been kind of that's their mandate. It's, they're in charge of it. We can always work with them. But when you have a group like the department in Canada called Employment Services Development Canada, their job is to just like grow jobs in Canada. when they're excited and interested in climate or green jobs and things like that, that's when we get excited, because then you're kind of bursting out of this bubble. And I've always felt like, wouldn't it be great one day if there was no environment department, or there was no, environment faculty at universities, that it was kind of ingrained throughout. So talk to me about that, and like the types of conversations you have kind of outside that like really small box of energy efficiency.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, and it's one I would co-sign that. So there's I went to the school at the University of Melbourne, and there's a professor called Robin Eckersley at University of Melbourne. She wrote this great book called The Green State. It's if you're into sort of the governance of climate change, it's a cracking read. And the point of the Green State is that it is actually really counterproductive to have environmental and climate issues kind of siloed in an environment department. And actually, you've got to think about how they integrated into the core of government. And ideally, that's, governments are very hierarchical, and that means that the locus of these kind of conversations should be driven out of central agencies, should be driven, in our systems, the Prime Minister's Department and Treasury, and it's really interesting when I observe, some of the policies, and because we've got federal system, we've got certain different structures, and the energy efficiency sits in different places in different parts of the country. When Treasury is involved, stuff happens. because all the other government departments are very used to listening. Just there's no kind of what are you going to do? It's the environment department. You're going to hit me with a damp twig. No, it's the Treasury department. You do what they say. There's no kind of ifs, buts, or maybes. Right. Regardless of what the conversation is. And so I think forward-looking governments are aware of those power dynamics, and if they're serious about things like net zero, it's like, okay, we're transforming our economy, and that is not a siloed conversation. That is a whole of government conversation. So I've probably gone a bit broader than perhaps the question you asked me, but it's actually a topic I'm very passionate about, because for leaders, particularly political leaders, that are interested in driving systemic change, they need to start by changing government. And these concerns need to be integrated into every department right across government, including jobs, but also industry and health. Every part of government is impacted, and needs to take a leadership position on this.
Yeah, 100% agree. I want to make sure we chat about some of your success in driving policy, because 18 out of 25 on the international ranking, that doesn't matter to me. What matters is that everywhere across the world, someone's doing great stuff, and we can all learn from each other about their particular great thing. And one of the things that kept popping up in my feeds over the last little while is this Neighbours program that you've been instrumental in getting off the ground. And it's the National Australian Built Environment Rating System. So talk to me about that, because I've seen, other countries taking that on. It seems like it's this global leading initiative, and maybe like we don't have something like this. So maybe you can kind of just riff a bit on that, so that the listeners kind of understand what it is, how it came about, and maybe there's a chance we can bring it to Canada.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll start by saying I'm not personally responsible for Neighbours. It's been around since 1999.
Come on, just take it.
I would regard myself as one of the many custodians of Neighbours. I do sit on the Neighbours steering committee, but there's plenty of people that have a deeper interest and a love of Neighbours here in Australia. National Australian Built Environment Rating System, as I say, developed in 1999 by the New South Wales government, importantly in collaboration with industry. And this is a rating system that covers all manner of sustainability metrics, but importantly for our conversation, and really where it started, was that it rates the actual energy performance of buildings. So this is not a rating that is focused on characteristics. It actually doesn't care about characteristics. It's about how a building actually performs. And there's different Neighbours energy ratings focused on different sectors. So you've got office buildings is the big one, and where the biggest impact has been had, but it also rates shopping centres, data centres, hotels, hospitals, and the algorithms that generate these performance-based ratings are all tailored to the relevant metrics and for the building type that they're addressing. And it really allows a like for like comparison. So, found 1999, it trundled along as a voluntary rating for a number of years, and then it's kind of had its first sort of uptick in kind of proliferation. And that was when the Australian government in 2005 said, you know what, we're going to require all our tenanted buildings to have a NABERS rating. And all of a sudden, industry's like, oh, what's going on? If we want to, the Australian government as a tenant, we need to have a NABERS rating. What's all this about? That sort of, drove greater integration and collaboration with industry. And then in 2011, the Australian government came in and said, you know what, every office building and that is above 2,000 square metres has to disclose their NABERS rating at point of sale and lease. So that obviously, again, another big uptake in the ratings framework and the proliferation of ratings. And then in 2017, with that threshold was dropped to 1,000 square metres. So at this point, we have 78% of offices rated right across the country. NABERS ratings are associated with higher occupancy rates, higher rents, higher property values. They've really become a proxy for building quality. And since their inception, they've avoided $1 billion in energy costs, and they've cut 7 million tonnes of CO2 emissions. So this is the crown jewel of the Australian energy efficiency landscape. It's an incredible collaboration between industry and government. There's more that we can do, and there's a lot of work that's underway to expand. The goal of the NABERS program is to get to a point where they're rating every single type of non-residential building in Australia. That's where the focus is at the moment. It's on non-residential buildings, and potentially, there's an ongoing conversation and some recommendations sitting in government, which would see just the disclosure regime expanded beyond office buildings to other subsectors. And so we're incredibly proud of it. And as you say, it's sort of been starting to be picked up around the world. So New Zealand adopted it in 2012. We've just seen the UK adopt it. And this is very, very hot off the presses. November 2020 was when NABERS UK was started. And we've just released a report here at the Energy Efficiency Council, which was looking at opportunities for collaboration between Australia and Germany. And we found through that process that there's actually, Germany finds itself in a very similar position, I think, to Canada, based on what you've said over our last few conversations, in which that there's kind of no equivalent kind of rating system. There's no equivalent disclosure regime for commercial buildings. And there's interest in kicking the tire on NABERS playing a role there in Germany as well. So it's something that, when we think about, the work we do in this sector and impact, that insight that you just pointed to, that everywhere around the world, everyone's doing some stuff really well. And given the rate of transition that we're working our way through, we don't have time for all of us to kind of recreate systems and processes, 180 times in 180 different countries. Right. We just need to beg, borrow, steal, collaborate. Here you go. Work with this. It worked for us. Just, really rapid kind of translation and sharing and just making stuff happen.
Yeah.
And if NABERS is our contribution to that, I would be absolutely delighted.
It'd be huge, right? Yeah, because we peg that up, and I'm happy to steal it from you guys. So we may just do that.
It's not actually technically mine, but
I know. But when we convince the federal government here to do it, then I'll just say it's. Okay, so we could talk about that. Could be a whole other thing. Quickly, just on that, and then I'm going to go to some questions from the audience. One of the challenges we have is this federal provincial kind of jurisdictional issue. And in Canada, Ontario, where I live, our most populous province, is the only one that has a building benchmarking law. Yep. There's kind of rumblings from others, and now some municipalities, some cities are trying to do it, which creates this kind of fragmented approach, because developers and like property management companies and stuff, they've got buildings everywhere, so it's just frustrating that you have to have different things. So like, I know you weren't around right at the beginning, but having that national approach and just basically saying everyone, and then 78% of the buildings comply, I mean, that's a huge win in and of itself. So how did that happen?
I think what was really important in the Australian context was the fact that it wasn't mandatory immediately. So there was kind of time for industry to sort of get their head around what it meant, and even that in 2005, when the Australian government adopted it as, you need a neighbours rating, and over time that's been adopted by state governments around the country, and now it's like you need a minimum neighbours rating. It's 1 to 6, so you might need a minimum neighbours rating is 4 to even be in the running for a procurement contract. It was kind of this, and that's why I told the whole story. There was a long pathway from 1999, when the first kind of neighbours energy rating was developed, through to 2017, where every building over 1,000 square meters needs to be rated. So and it was knocking the bugs out of the system, getting confidence from the industry, and then having regulation which was sensible, very light touch. Like, nobody has to do anything. There's no minimum neighbours rating. If you have a 1 star, then good luck to you. See how you go in the market. Yeah. It's about transparency and consumer protection, so that it's just providing another information or data source for tenants and potential property buyers to say, well, what's going on with this building? What are the implications going to be for my energy bills? And so I think it's that going on that journey over a period of time that has really helped. And now, you find we're in a situation now where industry has a huge sense of ownership over neighbours. The governance is fascinating. We can schedule another one of these one day to talk about neighbours governance. We'll thrill your listeners, I'm sure, with that conversation.
There are enough nerds out there that would love to hear it, I'm sure.
But it's actually run by the New South Wales government still, who's got the federal government, all the state governments on the steering committee, along with industry. So there's like 8, 9, 10 industry representatives sort of balancing out, and decisions around neighbours are made collaboratively within that group. So it's a really interesting case study. Now, the way that neighbours roll out in Australia is a little bit unique, and it's not necessarily going to be the way that it's going to achieve success in other jurisdictions, but the building blocks are there and the lessons are there. So it's insights we're happy to share, Corey.
Great. So a couple questions. Why don't we just stick with neighbours, because there's a couple questions related to that. One, tongue-in-cheek, Natalie asks if neighbours' name is a play on the famous Australian soap opera Neighbours, which is
I'm going to say yes.
Aside from Crocodile Dundee, your greatest export to Canadians. But in seriousness around that, one of the things that's driving some conversation here is this issue of embodied carbon related to new buildings. I'm assuming because it's that Neighbours is for existing buildings, you're probably not tackling that because there's not much you can do. But so that's number one. But also number two is around, which I think something that can be added to Neighbours, is climate change readiness and adaptation and flood prevention and things like that, which is really kind of becoming a big thing here as well. Any connection between those things and Neighbours?
Yeah, so Neighbours hasn't gotten into embodied carbon yet, but it is fair to say that Neighbours has evolved over time as the needs of the market have evolved. So there's now, I've been talking about Neighbours energy, but there's also Neighbours waste, there's Neighbours water, there's all these different sustainability metrics that building owners can leverage to kind of understand where they sit relative to their peers. Where it does play a role in new builds is what we call commitment agreements, which is where you commit to achieving a certain operational performance at the design phase, and then after you've got 12 months of occupancy data, you can then confirm that you've achieved the performance that you committed to. And so that's a way of new builds kind of leveraging the Neighbours system to kind of demonstrate leadership in the space. What was the second question?
Oh, just around readiness, like an adaptation and flood prevention, things like that.
I think resilience is something which is, very high on the agenda for property developers, building owners. It's not something that Neighbours has spent a lot of time tackling yet. There's actually another rating system in Australia which also has a lot of currency called Green Star, which is run by the Green Building Council of Australia,
Right.
and they've been doing more work, I think, over on the resilience front. But we've got a really good dynamic here in Australia. There is sort of lessons being learned from Neighbours and Green Star, and often those flow backwards and forwards between the two systems. And it's one of the reasons why the Australian property sector is often topping global sustainability indexes, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and GRESB and things like that. It's
Amazing.
Yeah, it's a good little thing we got going down here, and as I said, we'd be pleased to export it to the world.
Great. Natalie asked, if you were to step back and think of the most kind of impressive campaign or project that the Energy Efficiency Council has run, what would it be? The one that captured the most attention, the one that kind of you feel moved the needle, and maybe even one that you were most proud of?
I was really actually proud of our work during the pandemic last year. So I talked about the work that the IEA did, and it was incumbent upon us to really amplify that here in Australia. It's and ground it in what was going on in an Australian context. And so we held a summit in, I believe, early July last year, sort of early months of the pandemic. Everyone's scrambling, and we were able to pull together a bunch of global and local experts. We did it in collaboration. It wasn't an Energy Efficiency Council thing. It was Energy Efficiency Council, peak body for the property sector, peak body for Australia's manufacturing sector, and our peak body for the social services sector. So a cross-sectoral kind of grouping. And it was one of those things where it's not always the thing that you spend the most time on that is the most impactful.
Yeah.
Because we sort of went from idea to running this thing in about 2 weeks, and we had and it was all online, so it was kind of in the early days. It was all getting, and as you can see, I've got my microphone, and we're very well set up these days. It's all kind of old hat, but we were still all working. We were working it out in early July last year. And it was just incredibly well attended. With 2 weeks notice, we had almost 1,000 people from around the country dialed in, and then it was kind of the ripple effects out from that kind of that cohort that were listening in, and then that were effectively activated by that session. To the degree, like there are many parents of success, I think the saying goes. And so, I don't want to take credit for what the Victorian government subsequently did. There were a lot of people that made a contribution to that, and there are indeed other organisations that are doing flagship reports and really beating the drum. But it was kind of like one of the things that kind of really drove the conversation around the role of energy efficiency and stimulus right up the agenda. And and we've sort of taken lessons from that. There's an awful lot around digital engagement that we had on the to-do list for years. Small organisation, like I've got 10 staff. It's we're doing our remit is a little bit bananas, like in terms of the stuff that we're trying to cover off. And so, there's all these things that you think, oh, that'd be nice, but you never get around to it. But of course, we had to lean into digital last year, and we found the effort to impact ratio on a lot of that stuff was really, really good. And so we've maintaining the webinars, and we're doing the podcasts, and we're doing all of those different bits and pieces, because you're in a position to reach more people than you ever could if you tried to put them in a room.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the world didn't have a dedicated energy efficiency podcast before this. We didn't
need one.
No, come on. We did need one. And same thing with this discovery session that we used to do it internally, just us, and someone would throw an idea and teach us something every Friday. And then as soon as the pandemic started, we're like, why don't we just open it up to everyone? See if people can learn as well, and people love it. So you kind of, you're right. You can plan a campaign, you can plan all this stuff, and then you can do all this other stuff, and then in 2 weeks you can get huge success. So you never know where. I mean, if we learned anything in the last year, it's that you never know where that success can come from.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I want to talk a little bit about politics. And Hamoda asked a question, and it's kind of related to what Lindsay's asking too. Yeah, we talked about this term bagging versus, applauding. And, an NGO has to, or an industry association kind of has to be, nonpartisan and sort of neutral. But I think what you're seeing around the world is kind of, policies are being driven on political rivalries. And that's what kind of Hamoda's asking is, how do you deal with that in Australia? And are you in a point where you can call out the kind of bad actors versus the ones that are driving the right policy, or do you kind of have to be friendly with all the various different parties? You never know when they're going to be in power.
Well, ultimately, I think you need to be, there needs to be a modicum of respect. It's important to say there are a range of roles in the kind of the advocacy ecosystem. There are people that their role is to just tear the place down, to call out bad faith, to kind of if we're not doing all the things we need to be doing like 5 years ago, then you're dead to me. Like that is a role.
Yeah.
That is not our role.
Right.
Our role is as an industry association. We're probably more middle of the road in that respect. And we need to be, we need to have, and where the view of our board is that you need to be able to have conversations with all sides of politics, because ultimately, if we're going to do this thing, we need to build a consensus in the centre of politics, which is resilient. That's the thing. Like, it's not, this is not, this view of, the role that we play is not like us, rolling over and going, oh, we're just going to, roll with, whatever the government of the day says. It's actually, my theory of change, the one I subscribe to, is that you need to do everything you can to build that consensus in the centre. And you don't do that by yelling at people. At least not all the time. Maybe you need to yell at some of the time. We talked about that earlier, but you can't. Yeah. You're not going to get them on board by yelling at them all the time. And so, my job is to find the arguments and find the mechanisms to get to a point where energy efficiency is just completely uncontroversial, and everybody sees that it's it's what we need to get on with. And what I would say is, while there's been a great deal of contention around climate policy, particularly at the national level in Australia, what observers around the world that have got a vague idea about what's happening in Australia probably don't have this sort of granular knowledge, is that there's a very high degree of consensus at the state level, and that's for progressive and conservative governments. Indeed, the New South Wales government and the Energy and Environment Minister Matt Keane is one of the foremost champions of the economic opportunities around net zero, and he's in many ways leading the national debate on that front. And so it's not even the case that you can kind of characterise political views in this space. It's very, and particularly, and we've talked about this, Corey, in countries like ours, which are kind of very dependent on extractive industries. We've enjoyed cheap energy for a really long time, and that's kind of been one of the foundation stones of our economy. This is a pretty, challenging transition, and we need to find ways of both maintaining momentum without kind of blowing up the consensus, because what I have seen in Australia is that you can lose a lot of time if all of a sudden the political consensus crumbles and you don't have both sides of politics on board.
Right. And then you're starting from scratch again. Yeah. One of the things that's happening here, and Lindsay talks about this, is we are really starting to feel and see the impacts of climate change. And I know this is a big issue in Australia with wildfires, and now there's heat waves here. And British Columbia had a city in British Columbia yesterday had a 47.5 degrees Celsius temperature, which is obviously a record for them and for Canada. And it really is it's right in our face now. And I'm just curious, and Lindsay's kind of asking, how does that color your advocacy work? I know you're trying to more in the center and you're building coalition and you're kind of building consensus, but at some point people need to kind of connect the dots between exactly what they're seeing right in their face to the policies that you're advocating for.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. And building consensus doesn't mean kind of sugarcoating the reality, and we're very upfront about the challenge that is being faced, and the need to drive that transition. We talk, the conversation in Australia is very much focused around net zero, but it's the thing that we try and do and the contribution that we try and make, and we're kind of uniquely placed to do so in the energy efficiency sector, I mean, in terms of energy sector bodies, is to talk about, net zero it can sort of devolve into a hashtag. Like, people are either for it or they're against it, and they don't even really understand what it means.
Right.
But it's kind of like, it can divide along partisan lines. We sort of, net zero is useful concept if you break it down and think about what, it's actually about what the transition pathways are for different parts of the economy to get to a given outcome. And you can argue about what the outcome is, and whether it's net zero or, in 2050, and whether 2050 is the right date and all that kind of stuff. But we try and play a role of breaking down the conversation, because in energy efficiency, you need to deal with the different challenges and opportunities in each sector of the economy. And you need to meet people where they are and actually talk about what those transition pathways look like. And our members are very, adept at doing that, because it's not about stapling solar panels to things. It's about thinking through what's happening in a particular building, what's happening on a particular manufacturing site, what's happening in a particular sort of resources site, what's happening in and how people are interacting with their workplaces and the like. And so we come from a very grounded place. And what I'm observing with our members is that it's the energy managers that are transitioning neatly and seamlessly into the role of carbon managers, because it's a lot of the same skills, right? And in many cases, energy is the most significant sort of chunk of carbon abatement that's available to businesses. It's often the most cost-effective source of carbon abatement for businesses. And so what we're able to, and this is often the case, you've got this broad base of members, and our job is kind of capture all that information, then feed it back up. And what we're trying to feed back up is saying, look, we need to unpack this conversation. This conversation is way too high level. We need to talk about what's going on in the manufacturing sector. We need to talk about what's going on in commercial buildings, residential. Right. And then you can start to talk about, well, what are the interventions and how, and what are the practical things that we can do in the next, not in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, but the next 2 or 3 years to kind of drive us towards that. Like net zero, great. What are we doing next year?
Yeah. That's exactly. Making that connection. Yeah. Okay. So I got the last question. It's the sort of it's great to be a host, because then you can have the final word. But I was kind of joking before, but I'm serious. I mean, your podcast that you've launched, for those who don't know it, First Fuel, is great. And it's not great just because of your guests, but you have a really good skill in being able to tease out various different things and lessons and things like that. And you have obviously Australian, people in it, but you also have people from around the world. I was happy to be a guest on it. I know Steve Nadell from ACEEE's been on it. There's been lots of different people on it. So you've done 44 of these. What's like the number one lesson or the thing you've learned from doing this? And I'll just say also, I hope you do 44 more, because they are great.
I'm actually up to 45 now. We released an episode last week.
Nice.
So no, it's been a great pleasure doing the podcast. We launched it in April last year, and as you say, we've done 44 episodes so far, and I don't have any plans to stop anytime soon. For me, and I'm going to share something here. It was I was in the olden days, I would have coffee with people. Pre-COVID, I would have coffee with people, and that would be the way that I would kind of prime the pump of my thinking, and kind of get the new thinking, and kind of then I'd sort of distill it and feed it back into our work. And that just stopped, like, in a very dramatic way when COVID hit and we went into that first round of lockdowns. And working through the lockdown here in Melbourne, that was something that was quite extended experience for us. It ended up being about 6 months where none of that was happening. the podcast was a very selfish way for me to continue having those conversations.
Right.
And it was also, I worked out, and part of the reason why we kept doing it is it was filling a space for our community, not just in Australia, but around the world. And it was, half an hour each week where people could, stick some earbuds in and they'd be sort of hearing or feeling like they were part of some of the conversations that they would have been having if they weren't sort of stuck at home,
right.
with toddlers crawling all over them or whatever.
Yeah.
So people have been very kind, and it's, we've been really thrilled at the response. We have 70% of our listeners are in Australia, but 30% of them are global. And, it's a great honor to be talking to people right around the world with the podcast. The thing that I've learned, to answer your question, is that I kind of mentioned it earlier. It's just, we're just dealing with all the same stuff everywhere around the world. Like, that's the thing. Like, and there's so much commonality in the kind of the challenges and the opportunities associated with the demand side. It's undervalued everywhere. Like, there's no country in the world that has really nailed this thing of kind of really getting a big Sharpie and underlining and making people understand how absolutely crucial it is. And we interviewed the founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. It was like episode 8 or episode 9, and I said to him, look, the energy efficiency. It's almost impossible to get to net zero without leveraging energy efficiency. And he said to me, no, Luke, you need to stiffen your spine. It is impossible. You cannot do it. And it's those sorts of interactions which kind of go, yeah, you're right. Like, we need to actually call it for what it is and actually tell those stories. And it is it's building this community across the world rather than us being like, the Efficiency Canada, Efficiency Council here in Australia. It can feel a little bit like being the prophets in the night. It can feel, but it's got a very lonely experience because you've got all these different sort of competing priorities and you're sort of banging the drum for energy efficiency. But we're actually, there's, like, when you join the dots between the organisations, the individuals working around the world, then there's a commonality of purpose. There's an incredible amount of passion. Lovely people, and and strength in numbers. And if we work together and we share those stories, then we're going to get it done. Is kind of what I've taken out of it all. But we need to join the dots, and we need to collaborate, and we need to leverage off each other's strengths. We need to program everybody to take neighbours and spread it around the world. All of those things. If we do all that, we'll be in good shape.
That's great, and that's a great way to end it. And I really do thank you for your role in doing that. And the only thing I'll add to that about the commonalities across the world is our senses of humor. And I think that you in particular, somehow you and I are on that same wavelength. So, but thank you so much. And I think that what you're doing in Australia, there's definitely things we can learn from here in Canada. Likewise, we'd love to kind of work together with you on some things we're doing that you could bring to Australia and then around the world. So this has been great. I really do appreciate your time. It's late at night, so good night. Have a good sleep. And for those listening, and just a word that we will not be doing Discovery on Friday, which is when we normally do it this week. The holiday is July 1st. On July 2nd, we are closed. So this is the Discovery for the week. It is recorded and will be spread around, and we'll be back on our regular programming on July 9th on the Friday. So we look forward to having you there. And just again, thanks, Luke. We really do appreciate you joining us, and such a great conversation.
Thanks, Corey.